I've worked amongst the suffering of the world for most of my adult life. As an army officer, I served in the Balkans and came face to face with the horror of genocide. In Northern Ireland, I've worked amongst divided communities, and I've seen the effects of human trafficking in northern Bangladesh. This year we lost a close member of our own family, almost certainly to the coronavirus. Now, over the years I've been sharing my Christian faith, the issue of suffering often comes up in conversation pretty early on. And so grasping the nettle firmly, it usually comes down to one or both of two questions. If God is good, why does he allow suffering? And if he's all-powerful, why doesn't he just stop it? Now, the oldest book in the Bible is the book of Job, and it's often struck me that even before any creation story was recorded, questions surrounding the suffering of innocents were being wrestled with. These are not new questions. One of the most unhelpful tendencies perhaps in Christianity is where we try to offer answers to questions where the answer is just simply not there. Perhaps that is part of the message of Job. And yet in a society that increasingly demands answers to everything, that is not a popular position to be in. There's a deep mystery to the suffering of humanity. Now, my dad was an amazing man, and much of his legacy to me is wrapped up in a few sound bites that shaped my life from my earliest memories. And one of which is this. He used to say quite often, Ben, start from the known and work to the unknown. And so in answer to this question, all I've ever really been able to do is just offer those bits of the jigsaw puzzle that I do have. I couldn't worship a God that ignored the suffering of his children, and nor would I ask anybody else to. We don't have to look far in the Bible to see that Jesus spent almost all of his time in ministry amongst those who were suffering. Lepers who'd been sent out of the city having to beg for food. The woman who's having a constant period for 12 years and so had been isolated in shame. What about the guy that was made to live in the cemetery because he was tormented into self-harming? These were real people suffering. And Jesus experienced grief and loss. His cousin was beheaded. He wept over the death of his best friend. Far from being a God that ignores suffering, Jesus demonstrated that he was drawn towards it in compassion. So much of the significance and power of God becoming man can be found in his experience of the suffering of humanity. And does God send suffering to punish us? And I read a very sad article the other day from America that suggested he did. Really? How could I on the one hand describe God as being a loving father and yet in the same breath say that he punishes us by making us suffer? Jesus addresses this directly. Yes, we can suffer as a result of our own mistakes. I'll testify to that. But it's not a punishment from God. It's simply the consequence of my own poor choices. And there's that great verse in the Bible that says that even then, God can use all these things for good. He is a God that can turn all of our lives around. But of course, at Easter time, we think about the God that allowed himself to suffer. He could have avoided it, but he saw the necessity for him to accept it. At any time, God could simply have stopped the world, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to accept his own path of suffering so that ultimately he could release us from ours. And God does have an answer to the suffering of the world, for his promises one day he will make all things new. His own suffering and death opened the door to the resurrection life that is freely available to all of us. And yes, I warn you, for many this can't come soon enough. But whilst we wait, he asks us to invite him into our suffering, a suffering that he truly understands. And when we do, we find that far from being a God that is distant to our predicaments, God is wanting to be personally involved in them. He is compassionate, he is loving, and he can bring joy in the midst of the darkest of places. So yes, at times we all ask these questions. We wouldn't be human if we didn't. And I'd be devoid of any integrity if I said that I have all the answers, because I simply don't. But the answers that I do have lead me to know that we have a loving God that simply wants to walk through these times with us and is simply waiting for us to invite him to do so.